My daughter-in-law called me at 7 in the morning on a Thursday. She didn't say hello. She said, "We need to talk about Thanksgiving." By Friday, I had made 3 phone calls, signed 2 documents, and quietly begun dismantling the life my son believed he was entitled to inherit. When they arrived at the house they thought was theirs, the locks had been changed, the driveway was empty, and a sold sign was staked in the front yard. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you how a man who spent 38 years building a plumbing supply business from a single truck and a borrowed phone number ended up sitting alone at a kitchen table on a Thursday morning, finally deciding he was done being patient. My name is Gerald Holt. I'm 63 years old. I live in Knoxville, Tennessee, in the same brick house I bought with my wife Patricia when our son Caleb was 4 years old. Patricia passed away from ovarian cancer 2 years ago this past March. If you've ever lost the person who was the center of your world, you know what the house feels like afterward. Every room holds a version of her. The garden she planted, the handwriting on the recipe cards in the kitchen drawer, the way her reading glasses still sit folded on the nightstand because I haven't been able to move them. I'm not telling you this so you'll feel sorry for me. I'm telling you this because my grief was the weapon they chose to use against me. My son Caleb is 37. He's a decent-looking man, broad-shouldered, with Patricia's eyes, which is something I try not to think about too much. He married a woman named Renata 6 years ago. Renata came from money, or at least she came from the idea of money, which is a different thing entirely. Her family had the vocabulary of wealth without the discipline that creates it. Her father, Dennis, was a man who talked about investments the way people who have never made one tend to. Her mother, Sandra, evaluated every room she entered for whether it was worthy of her. And her younger brother Kyle was 29 years old with no discernible job, a rotating series of expensive hobbies, and a magnetic talent for appearing wherever a free meal was being served. For the first 3 years of Caleb and Renata's marriage, I kept my opinions to myself. Patricia would have wanted that. She always said you don't get to choose who your children love, you only get to choose how you treat them. So I treated Renata with respect. I paid for the wedding. $112,000 held at a vineyard outside Asheville that Renata had selected, and I had financed without being asked. I gave them a down payment on their house in Brentwood, $80,000 transferred from a savings account. Patricia and I had spent 20 years filling. I brought groceries. I fixed the water heater. I drove 4 hours round trip to assemble furniture, Caleb said. He didn't have time to put together himself. After Patricia died, I noticed something shift in the way Renata spoke to me. The politeness didn't disappear, but it thinned. She began referring to the Brentwood house as our home in a way that carried a specific emphasis. She started making comments at family dinners about how hard it must be for someone my age to manage a large property alone. She asked twice, in the space of 1 month, whether I had updated my estate documents since Patricia's passing. I noted these things the way a man who has spent 4 decades in business notes, small warning signs. You don't react. You file them away. The Thursday call came 6 weeks after what would have been Patricia's 61st birthday. I had spent that birthday anniversary quietly, the way I spend most days now, with coffee and the morning news and the garden she planted, talking to her the way people do when they need to say things out loud even though no one can hear them. When Renata called the following week, I was still raw in the way grief makes you raw without warning. I almost didn't answer. I wish now I had let it go to voicemail. She told me that Thanksgiving this year was going to be a smaller gathering. Just Caleb, herself, and her immediate family. Her parents, her brother Kyle. She said it in the smooth, rehearsed way of someone who has practiced the sentence in the car on the way to making the call. She said she hoped I understood. She said that after a difficult year she felt it was important for Caleb to be surrounded by his core support network. I held the phone against my ear and listened to her explain to me, with the patience of someone speaking to a slow child, that my presence at family holidays had become emotionally heavy for Caleb, that my grief was difficult for the family to manage, that perhaps this year I could celebrate with friends or neighbors. She actually said that, perhaps I could celebrate with neighbors. I said very little. I told her I understood. I thanked her for letting me know. And then I sat at the kitchen table for a long time, watching a cardinal work its way through Patricia's bird feeder outside the window. Caleb never called to confirm what Renata had said. He sent a text message that evening. It read, "Hey Dad, I think Renata talked to you. I hope you're not too upset. We can do something in December." That was the entire message. Now, if you have ever had to teach a family member the hard lesson that generosity is not the same as obligation, that love is not the same as a debt that can be collected, I need you to like this video before we go any further, because what happened next took everything I had. The text from Caleb sat on my screen for about 40 minutes before I responded. I told him that was fine, that I hoped they had a good holiday. My tone was warm. My hands were completely steady. I have been in rooms with suppliers who tried to steal from me, with contractors who cut corners and then looked me in the eye and lied about it. I know how to show nothing when everything inside you has gone cold. I set the phone down and walked to my study. I keep my important documents in a fireproof cabinet beside the desk, organized the way Patricia always insisted, by category and date. I pulled out the folder for the Brentwood property. When I gave Caleb and Renata that $80,000 down payment, my attorney at the time had offered to structure it as a formal loan with a recorded lien. I had declined. I thought it would feel transactional. I thought it would communicate distrust. Now I pulled out the gift letter I had signed and stared at it for a moment. Then I pulled out the deed. I read the names on it slowly. Then I picked up the phone and called my attorney, a man named Warren Fitch who has handled my business affairs for 22 years. Warren answered on the second ring. I gave him the facts without embellishment. The call from Renata, Caleb's text. And then the part I hadn't told anyone yet, the part that had been sitting in the back of my mind since a conversation I had accidentally overheard 3 weeks earlier when I stopped by their house to drop off a box of Patricia's things Caleb had asked for. I had let myself in through the side door the way I always had, the way Caleb had told me to do years ago, telling me their house was my house too. I heard Renata's voice from the kitchen, clear and carrying, the way voices do in open-plan spaces. She was on the phone. I caught my name. I stopped. I am not proud that I stood in the hallway and listened, but I am not ashamed of it either. What I heard changed everything I thought I understood about what was happening in my son's life. She was talking to someone, I assumed her mother, about the plumbing business. Specifically, she was talking about the value of the business. She referenced a number that was close enough to accurate that someone had clearly done research. Then she said something that I have turned over in my mind every day since. She said that the business was still in my name, that I had been declining since Patricia died, and that there was an attorney in Nashville her father had connected them with, who specialized in what she called protective conservatorships. She said that Caleb was reluctant, but that he would come around once he understood the financial logic. She used that phrase, the financial logic. I tell you that now so you understand that when Renata called me about Thanksgiving, I was not hearing from a daughter-in-law who had grown thoughtless and selfish. I was hearing from a woman who was executing a plan that required my isolation. A plan that required me to appear unstable, grief-stricken, difficult to manage. Every comment about my emotional heaviness, every question about my estate documents, every suggestion that perhaps I should spend the holidays with neighbors instead of family, these were not careless cruelties. They were deliberate architecture. They were building a structure designed to end with my name removed from the thing I had built and replaced with theirs. Warren listened to everything without interrupting. When I finished, the silence on the line lasted about 4 seconds. Then he said, "Gerald, I want you to stay completely calm and do absolutely nothing for the next 18 hours. Don't call Caleb. Don't respond to Renata. Don't change anything. I need to make some calls." I told him I had no intention of calling anyone. I went to bed that night and slept 6 hours, which was the best sleep I'd had in months. There is something clarifying about the moment you stop hoping a problem will resolve itself. When you finally accept that the foundation is compromised and the only honest course of action is to tear it out and rebuild from the ground up, the anxiety lifts. What replaces it is something quieter and much more dangerous. Warren called me the next morning at 8:15. He had used his connections in the Nashville legal community to make discreet inquiries. The attorney Renata had referenced was real. He specialized in adult guardianship and conservatorship cases. He had filed 3 such petitions in the past 18 months on behalf of adult children seeking control of aging parents' assets. Warren had found no active filing yet with my name attached, but the groundwork was consistent with preparation. The pattern was identifiable. They were not yet ready to move, but they were nearly ready. Warren told me we had a window, a narrow one, but a window. If I acted before they filed anything, I held every advantage. Once a petition hit the court system, even a fraudulent one backed by fabricated evidence, I would be spending time and money and emotional energy fighting instead of building. The goal was to make the fight unnecessary by removing what they were fighting for. He walked me through my options in the steady, unemotional way of a man who has seen this kind of thing before and understands that the law, used correctly, is simply a very efficient set of tools. My business, Holt Plumbing Supply, was structured as an LLC with me as the sole member. The Brentwood house, the one I had funded with $80,000 of my own money, carried no lien from me. The gift letter was clean. There was no legal mechanism by which I could reclaim that money directly. But there were other things I controlled entirely that I had allowed, out of love and out of grief and out of the desperate hope that generosity might purchase closeness, to remain exposed. I had added Caleb to a joint savings account the year after Patricia died because I thought it would make him feel included in the family's financial stewardship. The balance was significant. More than $400,000 in liquid savings that Caleb now had legal access to. I had also made Caleb a secondary signatory on the business operating account, a decision I made when I had a health scare 18 months ago and didn't want the business paralyzed if something happened to me. Warren had been the one to advise against both of those decisions at the time. He was too professional to say so now, but I could hear it in the measured way he did not say it. We began that morning. First, the business. Warren drafted an amendment to the LLC operating agreement formally removing Caleb's signatory authority. The document was clean, legal, and required only my signature. I signed it at Warren's office at 10 a.m., and he filed it before lunch. Then I sat down at a bank terminal with Warren beside me and transferred the entire balance of the joint savings account into a newly established individual account in my name only. $447,000, moved in a single transaction that was entirely legal, entirely within my rights, and entirely invisible to Caleb until he looked. I also called the insurance broker who managed the policies on the business vehicles and the commercial property. I updated the emergency contact and the policy management authorization. Caleb's name came off. Mine went back on, unambiguous and alone. By 2 in the afternoon, everything they had been counting on was gone. I went home and made a bowl of soup and ate it standing at the kitchen counter, looking out at Patricia's garden. I thought about calling Caleb and telling him what I had done and why. I thought about it for about 30 seconds. Then I thought about Renata's voice in that kitchen, talking about the financial logic of having her father's attorney file a conservatorship petition against a man who had done nothing but love his son without adequate self-preservation. I put the bowl in the dishwasher and decided the conversation could wait. Here is the part they had not anticipated. The business. Holt Plumbing Supply had operated for 38 years out of a warehouse on the east side of Knoxville. 3 delivery trucks, 12 full-time employees, contracts with 17 regional contractors, and a reputation I had built on the back of my word meaning exactly what it said. Caleb had worked in the business in his 20s, briefly, before deciding the margins weren't interesting enough. He knew the name of the business. He knew it was valuable. What he did not know, because he had stopped paying attention long before it became relevant, was that I had spent the past 14 months in quiet negotiations with a regional supply chain company based in Charlotte that had been looking to acquire established distributors in the Tennessee market. I had been moving slowly because I was not sure I wanted to sell. The business was the last major structure of the life Patricia and I had built together. Walking away from it felt like another loss. But Renata had clarified my thinking considerably. If I sold the business on my own terms before anyone could use it as a justification for a guardianship petition, I eliminated the most powerful asset in their argument. And I put the proceeds somewhere architecturally inaccessible to anyone who had not been specifically and legally designated to receive them. I called Marcus Webb in Charlotte on a Saturday morning. Marcus had been the patient one in our negotiation, willing to wait out my ambivalence, which I had always respected. I told him I was ready to move. He asked how quickly. I told him I wanted to close before the end of November. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said he would have his team prepare the final offer documents by Wednesday. I want you to understand something, because it matters to the rest of this story. I was not acting out of anger. Anger is an emotion that spends itself and leaves nothing useful behind. What I felt was closer to clarity. The kind of clarity that comes when you stop pretending that a structural problem will heal on its own. Caleb was not a bad man, corrupted by a bad woman. He was a man who had made a series of choices to value comfort over integrity, and those choices had led him here. The responsibility for what was happening was distributed, and I had my own share of it. I had given too much, too freely for too long, and in doing so I had taught him, without meaning to, that there would always be more where that came from. Thanksgiving arrived the way it always does in East Tennessee, gray and cold and smelling like wood smoke from the neighbors' chimneys. I was not in Knoxville. I was in Savannah, Georgia, staying at a quiet inn near the river, eating a very good meal at a restaurant I had found by simply walking until something looked right. I had told no one I was going. I had packed a bag on Tuesday night and driven down on Wednesday morning, stopping once for gas and once for coffee, with the radio on and the windows cracked despite the cold because the air smelled clean and I was in no hurry. I thought about Caleb's face at various ages. I thought about the Thanksgivings Patricia used to run like a general, 4 dishes going at once, the house warm and chaotic and full of exactly the kind of noise that seems ordinary until it stops. I thought about what she would say if she could see where things had arrived. I decided she would not be surprised. She had seen Renata clearly from the beginning. She had said nothing about it while she was alive because she believed in giving people the full length of the rope before drawing any conclusions. She had been more patient than I was, though neither of us had understood at the time that her patience was finite in a way mine was not. The business sale closed on the Monday after Thanksgiving. Marcus Webb's company wired the final payment into my individual account by 11 in the morning. I was back in Knoxville by then, sitting in Warren's office, watching the confirmation appear on the screen. The number represented 38 years of 6 a.m. mornings and broken equipment and difficult customers, and the particular satisfaction of a thing built from nothing being worth something real. I felt the loss of it, and I felt the rightness of it simultaneously, which is the complicated emotional register of any decision made at the correct time. That afternoon, Warren and I finalized the restructuring of my estate plan. The documents Patricia and I had created together were revoked and replaced. Every beneficiary designation, every trust instrument, every power of attorney. The new documents named Warren's firm as trustee of a newly established irrevocable trust funded with the proceeds of the business sale and the reallocated savings. Caleb was not named as a beneficiary. He was not named in any capacity. His name appeared nowhere in the new documents except in a single explanatory addendum, written in my own words, describing the reasons for his exclusion. Warren advised me to include that addendum for probate clarity. I wrote it without difficulty. The facts were simple, and the language required no embellishment. I had also spent the week before Thanksgiving making a series of phone calls I should have made months earlier. I called each of my 12 employees directly. I called the 17 contractors I supplied. I told them the business was being sold and that the transition would be handled professionally, that everyone's contracts would be honored, and that the people who had worked alongside me deserved to hear it from me personally and not from a document. Several of them cried. One of them, a man named Ray, who had driven for me for 19 years, told me that Patricia would be proud of the way I was handling things. That one stayed with me. Warren also sent a certified letter to the Nashville attorney Renata had been consulting. The letter was brief and precise. It described the completed asset transfers, the restructured estate plan, and the elimination of all business and financial interests previously accessible to Caleb. It noted that any conservatorship petition filed against me would be contested immediately and aggressively, and that the documentation supporting my full cognitive and legal capacity was comprehensive, current, and available upon request. The letter was not hostile in tone. It was the legal equivalent of a man standing in an open doorway, making very clear that the room behind him was empty, and the person knocking had nothing left to come in for. I do not know exactly when Caleb realized what had happened. I know it was a Tuesday, because that was when he called. I had been expecting the call, the way you expect weather, that the barometer has been predicting for days. I was in the garden when the phone rang, pulling dead growth from the beds Patricia planted along the back fence, working through the rows the way she had taught me, cutting back to where the plant is still alive. I pulled off my glove and answered. Caleb's voice was different from any version of it I had heard before. It was not the easy, slightly careless voice of a man who has always assumed the floor would hold. It was tighter, quieter. He asked me to tell him what was going on. He said his bank access to the savings account was showing an error. He said the plumbing business number was going to a different voicemail. He said Renata had gotten a letter from a lawyer in Knoxville that had frightened her. I sat down on the cold garden bench and looked at the beds Patricia had planted. Tulip bulbs she put in the fall before she got sick, arranged in the pattern she had drawn on graph paper the summer before, knowing she would not be there to see them come up in the spring but planting them anyway because she believed in future springs, even when she was running out of her own. I said, "Caleb, I know about the conservatorship." The silence on the other end of that line was the most complete silence I have ever heard in 37 years of being this man's father. It lasted a long time, long enough that I said his name once to confirm he was still there. When he finally spoke, his voice had dropped to something I had not heard from him since he was a teenager who had done something wrong and had been found out. He said he didn't know what Renata had been planning. He said it had gone further than he understood. He said he had told her he wasn't comfortable with it. I listened to all of it. I did not interrupt. I have spent enough time in negotiations to know that the most powerful thing in a room is frequently silence, and that a man confessing to partial knowledge of a wrong is usually confessing to more than he is saying. When he finished, I told him the facts plainly. The savings account was no longer joint. The business had been sold. The estate plan had been revised. His name was not in it. I told him that Warren had documentation of everything and that if a petition were ever filed, the response would be immediate and thorough, and would include referral to the district attorney's office for review of potential elder financial abuse under Tennessee statute. He started to cry. Caleb has not cried in front of me, or in my hearing, since he was 19 years old. The sound of it was not satisfying. I want to be honest about that, because the stories we tell ourselves about revenge tend to include a clean, cold satisfaction at the moment of reckoning, and this was not that. It was painful. He was still my son. He was still the child I had carried on my shoulders and watched ride a bicycle for the first time, and sat beside in a hospital waiting room when his mother was in surgery. The grief of that moment was real, and I did not pretend otherwise. But I did not change course. I told him that he was welcome to work toward rebuilding what had been broken between us, that I was not his enemy, and that I was not a man who believed in permanent conclusions when genuine change was possible. I told him that what I would not do was fund a comfortable life for people who had been actively working to strip me of my freedom and my assets. I told him that if Renata wanted to file a conservatorship petition in the current circumstances, she was welcome to, and that the outcome of that attempt would be the most expensive mistake either of them ever made. Then I told him I loved him, because it was true, and I ended the call. I put my glove back on and went back to Patricia's garden. The ground was cold and the work was slow, and I was not sure what the beds would look like in spring. But she had planted the bulbs in a pattern she had drawn with care, and I was going to tend them the way she would have wanted, and I was going to be there in April to see whether her faith in future springs had been justified. I have since heard from Caleb twice. The tone of those conversations has been different, careful, accountable in a way his voice rarely carried before. I do not know what his marriage looks like now, or what Renata has said to him about the way things turned out. That is, between them. What I know is that I spent 38 years building something real, and I spent 2 years after Patricia died slowly, allowing grief to soften my judgment about what I was owed and by whom. And I know that the moment I stopped waiting for people to become the versions of themselves I needed them to be, and started protecting the life I had actually built, something in me straightened up that had been bent for a long time. Patricia used to say that a man who keeps giving to people who take is not being generous. He's being afraid. I thought I understood what she meant when she said it. I understand it differently now. If you are a father or a mother reading this, and you have spent years pouring yourself into people who have stopped seeing the cost of what they receive, I want to say this directly to you. Generosity is a gift. It is not a contract that obligates you to keep giving when the other party has proven they are willing to use your love as a legal instrument. You are allowed to stop. You are allowed to rebuild the walls. You are allowed to protect what you worked for. And you are allowed to do all of it quietly, calmly, and without raising your voice. Because the most powerful thing a person can do in this world is decide, with complete stillness, that they are finished being taken from. The tulips came up in April, red and yellow, exactly the way Patricia had drawn them on her graph paper. I stood in the garden on a warm morning with a cup of coffee and I looked at them for a long time. She had planted them knowing she would not see them. She had trusted the ground to hold them through the winter and the spring to do its work. I think she would have been satisfied with how things turned out. I think she would have said, it was about time. Protecting yourself is not the same as closing your heart. Gerald never stopped loving his son. He simply stopped funding the version of love that was being used against him. When you finally draw a line, not out of anger but out of quiet self-respect, something in you stands straighter. Tend the things worth tending. Trust that the people worth keeping will find their way back to you in spring. A small note for you: this story was created and fictionalized by AI, crafted to bring you a moment of meaningful entertainment while leaving behind a lesson worth carrying into your own life.